This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. Today I'd like to speak about one of the great writers in the English-speaking language from the United States and look at her work in the context of questions that are significant for, certainly right now, for people throughout the United States, but of course throughout the world. And this writer is Marilynne Robinson. Marilynne Robinson, if you've never heard of her, is an author. She's an older author, primarily lived in the Midwest, and not only an author of fiction, of novels primarily, but also of nonfiction, collections of essays. She's, as far as her novels are concerned, her first novel was called Housekeeping, a beautiful small book. She followed it up with a number of novels. Actually, quite some years later, there's kind of a gap in her fiction that could be called the Gilead series. The first book called Gilead, and then Home and also Jack belong in that series. And her writing is quite beautiful. These are all beautiful works of fiction, and I choose the word beautiful intentionally. And besides her work as a fiction writer, she, as I've mentioned, she wrote a lot of essays. Some of them, for instance, Mother Country, The Givenness of Things. She also wrote a small book called Absence of Mind. And some of her deeper thoughts and concerns that also obviously are experienced in her work as a writer of fiction, she brings to really clear expression in the essayist tradition of the United States. It goes back to Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I'd like to talk about her work today, referring to some of her articles and essays, insofar as it relates to the United States and how in the United States, historically, and to some extent today, the way we feel about and think about what a human being is, what we are to one another, has shaped our rights, our conversations about what rights are, what rights should be, and civil rights in recent history. But going back all the way to the beginnings. But first of all, I'd like to kind of share with you one of her reflections that appears in the book Absence of Mind. The book Absence of Mind is a series of essays that really focuses on how there is characteristic kind of attempt to understand ourselves and to understand one another through reducing what we know about the human being and excluding the mind. So it's called Absence of Mind. And here in this book, she reflects on Darwinism, a kind of materialistic Darwinism that explains also culture, or tries to explain culture and art and beauty and also philosophy and everything in the humanities from a kind of biological perspective in a Darwinian framework of the survival of, let's say, survival of the fittest. So that might be a little bit limited in the way people understand it. And how the experience of the self, of the mental, of the mind, of the spirit is really suspicious. It's something that we don't trust, that we try to explain from outside. In this book, I just want to refer to the introduction. She reflects on her own experience in graduate education in the United States as a teacher. And in reading about the history of the United States, how she was meeting students who really came with a deep feeling of distrust for their experience of their own self, of their own ideals, and of the professed ideals of people throughout history in the United States. For instance, colonists in the North, the Puritans coming from England, and really the cultural legacy. She would experience, students would just say, yeah, the history of the United States is simply a history of capitalism and exploitation. And wanting to look at everything that unfolded over the last centuries only from that narrow perspective. This was one of the reasons that she wanted to write this book, Absence of Mind. Now, right now, today in the United States, there's a lot of tension in the country between what's going on and at least parts of the universities and academia and, let's say, politics. Most significantly focused on Harvard at the moment. And there's a kind of aggressive attack towards what is very simple-mindedly or narrowly called wokeism, but we'll just use that term. Everyone will be familiar with it who is following anything that's going on in the United States right now. And, well, it's a complicated situation. And I think that in this episode, one of the things I hope to do is to focus on one part of it, and really through reference to Marilynne Robinson. You know, one of the things that, if you read Marilynne Robinson's novels, when she is describing characters and also relationships between characters, first of all, there's a kind of sensitivity that you feel when she writes about someone, a character in her book, that it's like you can tell that she's turned towards another person, a character, with reverence and feeling almost like there's something coming to expression through a child or through a particular person that is divine, that has something like that there's something like a picture of something that's connected with a deep creative spiritual foundation in human nature. This, of course, will be familiar for anyone who's read her books. And she has obvious spiritual orientation, Calvinist, Christian, Protestant tradition. The characters that she writes about, sometimes they're clergy, but in other cases they're, for instance, an alcoholic, as the case in Jack, one of the books, or in another case, someone who has to go through, for instance, a period of total dejection and suffering, as in Lila. Yet, regardless of this, of any kind of what we would call moral kind of outer flaws, her orientation is such that it's almost like these people are seen as pictures of kind of moral and practical and societal dynamics. There's something in the human being that she turns towards with a kind of reverence and respect. I'm going to come back to this kind of artistic orientation in a moment, but first I'd like to just turn to something that she published. Is actually an article in the New York Review of Books from 2019. So this is like 6 years ago. And the title was Which Way to the City on the Hill? Marilynne Robinson. Now, if you're not familiar with the picture City on the Hill, this has a long history in the rhetoric of the United States going back to the early days. And without going into that, I'd like to just point out what she focuses on in this book. And one of the things that she tries to, not in this book, in this article, one of the things that she tries to show is when you look at the early years of the move of the colonists to North America, there were different cultural streams that were primarily coming from England to the North American East Coast. And in the North, you had the Puritans. And the Puritans, in this article she presents, they have a kind of a simplified negative reference today when we talk about the Puritans. I'm particularly thinking about, for instance, accusations of witchcraft and witch trials. And she goes out of her way to describe the situations in England and how in England, how strong the class structure was and how people were seen as situated within certain classes and with almost no hope of being able to, say, have any kind of social mobility, move between classes or parts of society. And how one of the things that in the North, at least, came with this group of religious refugees who were establishing some of the colonies in the North, was a certain kind of egalitarianism that was actually drawn deeply from the Gospels. And how they actually looked at each individual as a soul, as a spirit, and they had a kind of anthropology that was couched in religious dogma, Christian dogma. And the things that she points out is that this was something particular to the North. And in the South, for instance, you had colonies that were established more along English commercial lines. There's a set of laws that she writes about called Dale's Laws, where you had this really strict class-based constitution of the colony. And that in essence they were drafted by John Locke, the English philosopher. And part of this Southern set of constitutional attitudes and laws involved looking at people as serfs, looking at people as indentured servants, as property in a certain way, as things that could be acquired and disposed of, as objects that could be used for one's gain depending on what class that a person was in. And this is something that was a more direct influence of, let's say, the English culture during this time when colonization was happening. Now, Marilynne Robinson, at the end of this article, which anyone who would like to go into the details, I'll include a reference in the show notes. She pretty much suggests at the end that even if we're not aware of it, there are these two cultures related to rights and related to a kind of orientation towards the human being that have been really influential in the United States. One coming from the North and one coming from the South in the end. And when you look, for instance, at the spread of a legal philosophy that could justify slavery, we find that really much more aligned with the way of thinking that was in the Constitution in the South and Virginia. And if we look at the North, we see a way of looking at the human being that actually moves all the way through the civil rights movement in recent decades, that viewed the human being as a spiritual being, as a being that had a kind of dignity that was intrinsic to their particular soul or self, and a certain reverence for that core of what a person is. And that this was, in the end, also something that animated the abolition of slavery. And in the work of great leaders and like Martin Luther King Jr., who out of the Protestant tradition, this tradition also spoke about the expansion of civil rights and of the justification for the expansion of civil rights based on a picture of human beings as children of God, one of the most common pictures that he would employ. So an overtly spiritual orientation towards the human being that then really animated and inspired a lot of change in the United States during the 50s and 60s. Basically, in the words of Marilynne Robinson, and she refers to the thoughts of Henry Ward Beecher, actually something that he wrote in 1855, so 180 years before, quote, this is now Marilynne Robinson, these two radical theories of man. Man, one, a physical creature to be judged by effects produced in time, or man, two, a spiritual creature to be judged by the development to which he's destined, are at the root of all the antagonisms between the spirit of Northern and Southern institutions. So here, Marilynne Robinson characterizes looking at the human being more as a creature, as someone who can have effects in time and space, also effects of labor, of production, a kind of possible tool, and a view towards a human being who out of themselves has a significance that trumps all temporal, that trumps utilitarian orientations in a certain regard. So this is the argument that she makes that really characterizes kind of the Northern liberal tradition. Interesting to think of the liberal tradition in the North as connected to Protestantism, though we clearly see through the Quakers and also other deeply devout Christian groups decisive influence in abolition in support of the end of slavery and segregation. And then we see in the association of churches and Protestant churches during the Civil Rights Movement, the seedbed for the end of Jim Crow and segregation in the United States 50 years ago. So these two ways of looking at people, how widespread are they? How, in our sensibilities, how are they living? This, for Marilynne Robinson, is an essential question when looking at how we end up framing what civil rights are, what human rights are. Now, turning from the kind of historical and religious orientation that Marilynne Robinson obviously presents, I would like to just focus on the fact that Marilynne Robinson has in many ways an artistic sensibility. And she writes about her own process writing and how when she sits down, she tries to cultivate a kind of creative inner space where pictures start to come to her and kind of characters start to emerge, not a whole piece, not out of kind of an intellectual design, but out of a sensitive, kind of imaginative, inspired process. And how it's kind of a holy and sacred experience for her. And that this is how particularly her works of fiction, emerged. When we look at the role of art and how we experience one another, it's deeply connected actually with some of these questions that are so deeply important for Marilynne Robinson. I think she's also particularly sensitive to them because of her artistic orientation. So, and I'd like to refer to an address that Rudolf Steiner gave to young people in 1922, and it's in a book that was first translated as The Younger Generation, now translated as Becoming the Archangel Michael's Companions. And in the 11th address to this youth group that were involved in a youth movement 100 years ago, one of the things that he really focuses on is that we can't experience the spiritual individuality of another person through kind of intellectual or scientific frame of mind, and that it's through having an artistic orientation towards another person and also sensibility, like feeling, living into, for instance, what is coming to expression in the moment through how a person is being, how they're speaking, what's between the lines, what feelings are inspiring, how they're talking or how they're moving, that a real kind of attention to the individual, but with an artistic, open mind and open heart. You come into an experience of a person that you can't actually easily describe with concepts. It's more like an inner intensity, an inner plane of spiritual presence that you are able to access. And for him, this is one of the reasons that artistic education in elementary school and in high school and for young people in general is so important. Because in order to be able to actually get into something of a deeper relationship with one another, but also with how we even think about human beings and experience human beings, he saw it as ultimately dependent on this artistic sensibility. This is a quote from Rudolf Steiner. "If you educate the human being by what is abstract and scientific, he experiences nothing of your soul. He only experiences your soul if you approach him through art. For in the realm of the artistic, everyone is individual. Each one is a different person. It is the ideal of science that everyone should be alike. It would be quite a thing, so people say today, were everyone to teach a different science. But that could not be, for science confines itself to what is the same for all human beings. In the realm of the artistic, each human being is an individuality in themselves. But because of this, there can come about an individual personal relation of the child to the person who is alive and active artistically. And this should be so. True, one does not come to the feeling for the whole person as an outer physical being, as in earlier in childhood, but to a feeling for the whole person in the soul of the one who is to teach or to lead. Here, Rudolf Steiner is describing how in a classroom, in teaching, in how important it is also when children haven't developed, for instance, the capacity to understand things intellectually, which actually comes later in adolescence and young adulthood. It is really important to be able to have an artistic mood in the classroom and a creative relationship between one another so that they can experience this non-conceptual presence, which I think is very aligned to what Marilynne Robinson not only is inspired by in her writing of fiction, but her spiritual worldview, even though she couches it in a Christian religious tradition. The importance of artistic education. Now, what happens if we're not able to have a widespread culture that is really artistically shaped, artistically inspired in our schools? Generally speaking, well, there are other options for how we relate to one another. We might feel instead of relating to one another as individuals, we might be caught up in nationalism. We might also be caught up in racism. Instead of looking through all the different aspects of what a person is to a core that can't be defined by some kind of outer category like race, sex, nation, class, we will start to see each other more from these outer categories, these more sociological, external groupings that individuality emerges in or can emerge in. And then that could inform how we talk about rights. Be it a capitalist conversation, be it a communist conversation, be it a nationalist conversation. This is something that I think when you think about it in relationship to what's going on in the United States, kind of culture wars, which is a very broad term that can lose a lot of subtleties when you use it, but obviously which is really important for what's going on right now. We see that actually, as Marilynne Robinson described already in her introduction to Absence of Mind, she was experienced students that actually were being educated from this perspective in an inartistic way, because they were coming in and they were looking at all of human history with these grand generalizations, like generalizations of capitalism and simple forces of egotism, supply and demand, regulation, marginalization to explain everyone. Teaching in a university level, I think she met a lot of those more intellectual explanations that seemed to her to be actually blind to a whole area of perception because of this sweeping intellectual and abstract way that young people have been educated. And she was distressed about this. And obviously I feel like one of the reasons she felt it so deeply was because of her own artistic sensibility and orientation. What is lost when that is how you approach one another, how you approach individualities in history, and how you try to understand reality? Now you may say, well, this is a very romantic orientation towards art. You know, in the United States, the kind of niche that Marilynne Robinson is writing to, even though she's a very well-known author, one of the most famous authors in the English-speaking world maybe, you know, she's got this kind of romantic spiritual niche or genre that is really kind of anachronistic. I mean, really the future of art is obviously going to be much more connected with technology. It already is. If we look, for instance, at television shows, cinema, movie production. But I think that what we see actually is that a lot of what we call culture today isn't really even comparable to, I think, the kind of world of mystery of art and culture that we see in at least Marilynne Robinson's fiction. Because, like, I recently read a newspaper article where someone was describing how they would rather watch a television series of zombies and have nightmares and not be able to sleep than not be distracted today. And the reason is because when they look out at really what's going on in their own countries and around the world, it's so terrible that actually watching extreme content that is so disturbing that they can't sleep at night is a preferable option to facing reality. And for decades now, in the United States at least, you can see a kind of commercialization of culture, particularly in motion pictures and television, where a lot of the reasons for producing things is related to investment, popularity, and return on capital. And it's kind of a mass culture industry. And it has often very little to do with deeper qualities of beauty and art that we see Marilynne Robinson working with, and also that we can experience through reading her books. It's more of a spectacle culture. It's more of a culture of distraction and consumerism and really industry than art in the sense that has been indicated here. So, yeah, how will all of the questions about rights that are playing out right now in the United States, all of the really hatred that, at least from some people, is being drummed up in an indiscriminate way of people who come from certain countries like Mexico or Guatemala or El Salvador, where there's these blanket caricatures and challenges of civil rights orientations that have developed over long periods of time in the United States. What's going to happen in these cases? Yeah, this is one question that I think is going to be, it is already just existentially dramatic for people who are having to work their way through them and face them in the United States court system. Deportations based on administrative errors, people really not be given due process in the United States. These single cases, of course, are really meaningful, but in the longer arc of things, there are some really bigger questions of how we think about human beings, how we educate ourselves as a people to facilitate certain experiences of one another. And these experiences of one another then, in turn, affect how we think about the dignity of one another and whether or not we connect that dignity with a class, with a race, with a nation, with a sex, or whether or not we can go all the way to experience the individuality that is couched in all of those group labels, and that is, at least in the history of the United States, has played a truly meaningful role in how we think about and how we talk about and how we legislate rights. This is a production, Questions of Courage, that is a collaboration with the communications team. It's a small initiative within the Goetheanum, the School for Spiritual Science. The Goetheanum is only possible because of generations of volunteerism, giving, and support. And likewise, this is given freely, available freely. But if you're in a position to contribute to continued work, efforts like this, but also in my case, youth work through the youth section, I do invite you to make a contribution. Really, it's the only source of activity and creativity. It enables that. So thank you very much.